Daniel never wanted to be the center of attention. He was a young engineer from Earth, someone who liked to fix machines and solve small problems. Not a man who belonged in a royal court. Fate had placed him on a ship sent across the stars for a peace mission. He was chosen not because of his rank, but because he knew how to repair the colony's energy systems. Somehow, that skill had made him part of the delegation. When the ship landed on the colony's capital world, Daniel stepped into the great palace with nervous steps. The walls rose higher than any building he had ever seen, glowing with light from crystals that hummed softly. Soldiers lined the hall in perfect order. Nobles in rich robes whispered as the visitors walked by. Daniel felt their eyes on him, and he knew he did not belong here. At the end of the hall sat Queen Eleanor. She was calm, proud, and far more graceful than anyone Daniel had ever met. Her crown caught the light and cast a golden glow across her dark hair. She looked like someone who had carried the weight of leadership for many years. When her eyes met Daniel's, he quickly looked away, embarrassed. He was just a man from Earth, and she was a queen. The ceremony was long, full of formal speeches and ritual bows. Daniel tried to follow what the other members of his group did, but he felt clumsy and out of place. He knew he should not speak, yet his nerves were getting the better of him. At last, when the formal words ended, a great dinner was served in the hall. Long tables stretched across the floor, filled with food that looked strange but smelled warm and rich. Music filled the air, soft but strong, and nobles raised their glasses in honor of peace. Daniel sat near the end of the table, close enough to see the queen, but far enough not to be noticed. At least he thought so. But then, as she stood to offer a toast, her gaze rested on him once again. He froze in his seat. The queen of a star colony was looking at him, a simple engineer. He felt heat rise to his face, and in that moment he wanted to disappear. To break the weight of the silence, Daniel whispered a nervous joke to the man sitting beside him. He thought no one else would hear. With a half-smile, he said, "You would make a lovely bride." He had no idea why those words came out. Maybe it was the way the crown shone in the light, or maybe it was just his nerves. But as soon as he spoke, the hall went still. The queen had heard him. Her glass paused in the air. Her lips parted slightly. The hall grew quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. Daniel's stomach dropped. Wished he could take the words back. Wished he could vanish into the ground. But before he could say anything, Queen Eleanor spoke. "I accept," she said. The words echoed across the hall. Gasps spread among the nobles. Soldiers shifted but did not move. The advisors exchanged quick, worried looks. Daniel's heart stopped. What had he done? He had spoken a clumsy joke, and now the queen herself had taken it as truth. The hall was silent for a long, heavy moment. Then the music started again, softer now, as if unsure. People whispered. Some looked shocked, others angry, and a few even smiled as if they had witnessed something historic. Daniel could barely breathe. He had no plan, no idea what this meant. He only knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Queen Eleanor lowered her glass and gave him a steady look. It was not cold, not cruel. It was calm, as though she had made a choice. Daniel swallowed hard. He was just an engineer, a man who had never imagined standing in the center of a story. But now, with a single nervous joke, he had stepped onto a path he could not turn back from. Daniel woke the next morning with a heavy feeling in his chest. He lay in the guest chamber of the palace, staring at the high ceiling that glowed with faint light. He wished it had all been a dream, but he knew it was real. He had spoken a nervous joke, and Queen Eleanor had said she accepted. The memory made his stomach twist. He had no idea what was waiting for him now. Servants arrived to bring him food, bowing politely but watching him with curious eyes. He knew they had already heard the story. Everyone in the palace must have. Whispers followed him as he walked through the hallways. Some people looked at him with disbelief, others with open dislike. He was an outsider, a man from Earth, and now he was caught in a custom he did not understand. Later that day, he was led to the royal council chamber. Advisors stood in a circle around the queen. They all turned when Daniel entered, and he felt as if he had walked into the middle of a storm. Queen Eleanor sat on her throne, calm and steady, her crown shining in the soft light. She looked at him, and though her gaze was sharp, it was not cruel. It was the look of someone who had made a choice and was waiting to see if he would rise to meet it. The chief advisor spoke first, His voice was stern, and his words were clear. By ancient custom, the queen had spoken in acceptance. If the man who had offered the words withdrew, it would be seen as an insult to her honor and the honor of the crown. Daniel's throat tightened. He'd never meant it, never thought anyone would take his words as serious. But now, if he refused, he could cause damage far greater than his own embarrassment. He could insult a queen and perhaps break the fragile peace that had brought him here. Daniel looked at the queen, hoping she would release him from this mistake. But she did not. She only held his eyes, waiting. He realized she was testing him, not as a man she wanted for herself, but as someone who might have a role to play in something larger. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him. That evening he was invited to dine with the queen in a smaller hall, away from the stares of the nobles. The room was quiet, with tall windows showing the stars outside. The table was simple, with warm bread, fruit, and roasted meat. Queen Eleanor sat across from him, and for the first time since the night before, she smiled. "You are not like the others who come to this court," she said. "You are not a man of titles or power, yet you spoke without fear." Daniel swallowed and answered honestly, "I spoke because I was nervous, and I thought no one would hear me." "It was a mistake." The queen shook her head gently. "No words are a mistake when they carry truth." She leaned closer. "You saw me not as a crown, but as a woman. Few dare to do that." Yet he also felt something stirring inside him. She was strong, but also lonely in her role. He could see it in her eyes when the others were not watching. Over the next days, Daniel was kept close to the palace. Guards followed him, not in hostility, but in duty. Advisors questioned him about his life, his skills, his family back on Earth. Some of them clearly wanted to find faults, to show he was unworthy, but Daniel answered as best he could, told them about his simple upbringing, about fixing broken machines and learning through mistakes. Told them he was no warrior, no noble, only a man who tried to help where he could. The queen listened quietly through it all. Sometimes she would ask him small questions when they walked in the gardens. What did he think of the stars? What was his dream before he came here? He answered truthfully, and she seemed to value that honesty more than polished words. But not everyone was pleased. In the shadows of the council, some whispered that he was a danger, that he would weaken the crown. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, heavy with doubt. He knew trouble was coming, and he feared that one careless joke had set him on a path where every step would be judged. Daniel stood in the practice yard of the palace, his hands shaking as he faced the long line of soldiers. The morning sun was bright, and the air was heavy with the sound of steel clashing. He was not a soldier, but he had been told that if he wished to prove his worth, he would have to face the trial of honor. It was an old custom, one that tested courage, patience, and heart. The queen's advisors insisted it was the only way that people would ever see him as worthy of her words. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to explain that he was only an engineer, not a fighter. But when he looked at Queen Eleanor standing at the edge of the yard, calm and watching, he knew he could not walk away. If he did, everyone would call him a coward, and the queen's honor would suffer for it. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The first test was simple in name, but hard in truth. He was given a wooden staff and placed against a soldier in armor. The soldier bowed, then attacked with strong strikes. Daniel barely managed to block the first blow, his arms shaking under the weight. The crowd of nobles watched with cold eyes. They wanted him to fail. Daniel's staff slipped from his hands, and he fell to the dirt. The soldier raised his staff to finish the match, but Daniel rolled away, grabbed the staff again, and stood up. He did not fight with skill, but he refused to stay down. At last, the soldier lowered his weapon and bowed again. For the trial was not about victory, but about refusing to surrender. The second test was of wisdom. Daniel was brought into a hall with 3 doors. Behind one was safety, behind another was fire, and behind the last was a trap that could crush him. He was given a riddle, written in old words. Daniel read it slowly, his heart pounding. He had never studied the history of this place, but he thought about the simple truths he knew. He remembered what the queen had told him about honesty. He chose the middle door, and when it opened to reveal a safe passage, he let out a shaky breath. The nobles frowned, but the queen's eyes softened just a little. The third test was of heart. A prisoner was brought before him, accused of stealing bread to feed his family. The law demanded harsh punishment, but the man wept and begged. Daniel's voice was steady when he spoke. He asked for the man to be forgiven, saying that mercy was not weakness but strength. Many in the crowd disagreed, but the queen smiled for the first time that day. The advisors whispered among themselves, unhappy that Daniel had spoken against old tradition, but unable to deny that his words carried weight. By the end of the day, Daniel was bruised, tired, and uncertain if he had passed or failed. But when he walked back across the yard, the soldiers who had fought him raised their hands in quiet respect. They knew he had no training, yet he had stood his ground. That respect mattered more than the whispers of the nobles. Queen Eleanor came to him as the sun set. She looked at him with calm pride. "You did not fight with strength," she said, "but you fought with spirit. You did not answer with knowledge, but you answered with truth. You did not rule with law, but you ruled with mercy." She stepped closer. "The people will see you now, not as a joke, but as a man who will not bend." Daniel's heart pounded as she spoke. He wanted to believe her, but he still feared the whispers of betrayal he had seen in the eyes of some nobles. He knew there were many who wanted him gone, who would never accept him no matter what trials he passed. But for the first time since that night in the Great Hall, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe he was not as lost as he thought. Maybe his mistake had led him to something greater than he could have imagined. As the stars came out, Daniel stood beside the queen in silence. The trials were over, but he knew his journey was only beginning. The court was watching, waiting, and plotting. And somewhere in the shadows, he felt the weight of unseen eyes that would not rest until he failed. The palace was quiet at night, but Daniel could feel the unease in its halls. Servants whispered more than before, and guards shifted nervously at their posts. Something was wrong. He had seen it in the way some of the nobles looked at him after the trials. Their eyes were sharp, full of anger, as if his survival had stolen something from them. One evening, Daniel found himself walking through the library, trying to clear his thoughts. The air smelled of old parchment and ink, and the tall windows showed the stars outside. As he moved between the shelves, he noticed a scroll half hidden beneath a table. Curious, he picked it up and unrolled it. His heart sank. It was a message, written in hurried script, speaking of a meeting at dawn. It spoke of removing the queen and ending her rule before she could bind herself to a stranger from Earth. Daniel froze. He did not know who had written it, but he understood the danger. If the plot was real, the queen's life was at risk. He folded the scroll and hurried from the library. His first thought was to go straight to her, but he feared the advisors might already be part of the plan. He could not trust everyone in the court. That night, Daniel stayed awake, listening for sounds in the halls. When the palace grew silent, he slipped from his chamber and moved toward the council room. The scroll had named that place as the meeting point. He pressed himself into the shadows and waited. Soon, cloaked figures entered one by one. Their voices were low but filled with hate. They spoke of seizing the throne and making the queen step aside. Daniel recognized one of the advisors among them. His chest tightened. He had to act, but he was only one man. Aus. At last he crept away and made his way to the queen's chambers. The guards at her door looked startled to see him, but the urgency in his voice convinced them. He showed the scroll and told them what he had heard. The queen was woken, and though she looked calm, Daniel could see the fire in her eyes. "You should not have risked yourself," she said softly, but he shook his head. "I could not stand by while they plotted against you." She placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. "Then we faced this together." Before dawn, loyal guards surrounded the council room. When the traitors gathered again, the queen herself stepped into the hall, her presence strong and unshaken. Daniel stood at her side, his heart racing. The traitors tried to deny the charge, but the scroll was read aloud, and the guards testified to hearing their words. The queen declared them guilty of treason, and they were taken away under heavy guard. The hall was silent when it was over. Daniel felt weak with relief. He had expected danger, perhaps even a fight, but the queen's authority had carried the day. Still, he knew the danger had not passed. Those who remained loyal to the crown now looked at him differently, some with respect, others with greater hatred. They would not forgive an outsider for stopping their plans. Later that day, the queen met with him alone in the gardens. Sky above was bright and the air smelled of flowers. Daniel could not forget the darkness he had seen the night before. "You risked your life for me," she said. "Why?" Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because you trusted me when no one else did, because I could not let them take you from your people." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "Perhaps fate sent you here for more than a mistake." Daniel felt his cheeks burn, but he also felt stronger than before. He was still unsure of his place, still uncertain of the path ahead, but he knew one thing. The Queen was no longer just a distant figure to him. She was someone he would protect, no matter the cost. As the sun set behind the palace towers, Daniel stood at her side. The trials had tested his spirit, but the shadows of betrayal had tested his heart. And though enemies still lurked in the dark, he felt ready to face them as long as she believed in him. The great hall was filled once more, but this time the air was different. The nobles stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the throne where Queen Eleanor sat. At her side stood Daniel, dressed in simple robes, his heart beating fast. He still felt out of place, but he knew there was no turning back. The people were waiting, and the Queen had made her choice clear. The chief advisor stepped forward to speak, but the Queen raised her hand. Her voice carried across the hall, steady and strong. She told the court of the trials Daniel had faced, of the way he had shown courage without skill, wisdom without training, and mercy without fear. She spoke of the night when betrayal arose in the shadows, and how Daniel had risked his life to uncover the truth. Each word echoed through the hall, leaving no space for doubt. The nobles shifted uneasily. Some bowed their heads, unwilling to challenge her. Others clenched their fists in anger, but they said nothing. They could not deny what had happened. Daniel had proven himself, not with swords or crowns, but with a heart that refused to give up. Daniel stood still, his hands tight at his sides. He could not believe this was real. Just days ago, he had been a nervous man who spoke a careless joke. Now the queen of a great colony was speaking of him as if he had been chosen by destiny. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to meet the eyes of those who glared at him. He was no longer afraid. When the queen finished, she turned to Daniel. Her gaze was soft but unshaken. Before all who gathered, she declared that she accepted his words, not as a careless mistake, but as a vow. The hall erupted in murmurs, some shocked, others moved. Daniel's heart pounded as she stepped down from the throne and stood before him. "Do you stand by what you spoke?" she asked, her voice low but clear. Daniel's breath caught. He thought of his home on earth, of the quiet life he had once dreamed of. He thought of the nights he had spent doubting himself, and of the moments when he had seen her strength and kindness. He knew the answer before he opened his mouth. "Yes," he said, "I stand by it." The hall grew silent again. The queen smiled, not as a ruler, but as a woman who had chosen freely. Then she took his hand, and together they turned to face the people. The hall shook with the sound of voices. Some cheered, some muttered, but none could deny that history was being made. From that day forward, Daniel was no longer only an engineer. He was part of the crown, bound not by birth but by choice, and he still doubted him, and dangers would surely come, but he was ready. For he had learned that strength was not in titles or weapons, but in standing firm when the world expected him to fall. That evening, when the hall was empty and the palace quiet, Daniel and Eleanor walked in the gardens. The stars shone brightly above them, and the air was cool and still. She asked if he regretted speaking those words at the dinner table. Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. "At first I thought it was the biggest mistake of my life," he admitted. "But now I think it was the beginning of everything." The queen smiled, and in her eyes he saw not only a ruler, but a companion who believed in him. They walked together beneath the starlight, no longer queen and outsider, but two people who had chosen each other against every expectation. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with trials yet to come, but they would face it together. Daniel felt peace for the first time since he had arrived. A single nervous joke had changed his life forever, and now it had become a promise that stretched across the stars.